So, welcome to today. We are going to be talking about motherboards, aka MOBOs. Um, Very interesting subject, as this is kind of the backbone of your computer. Everything that you hook up to your system has to, in some way, connect through the motherboard. And not all motherboards are created equal. So we're going to be getting into the various different types, like the ATX, the ITX, the Nano, the Pico, and when they would be used. The primary roles we're going to be talking into more detail. Why, everything that's got to hook up: microphones, keyboards, graphics cards, anything you can think of, RAM, everything has to go through the motherboard. It is the central nervous system or backbone of your system. And every computer has one.
Can I interject a question?
Yes, absolutely.
So they're called motherboards. Does anyone know why that is? Or give a thought to it? Any of you guys?
The mother of all other boards.
Well, you construct a
I
motherboard,
mean,
you know that stuff works.
it seems to parent the situations within the computer in regards to being the dominant presence that everything extends from, like a parent would be to a child.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Or like Kelly said, the mother of all boards. But I was like, why not a father board, Or just
I don't know if they have
interesting.
those. They do have daughter boards, though.
Yes, they do. But I was like,
So,
yeah, so the main board, right? Mother, parents, the other boards, but also that the board itself has the female connections. So thus it relates to mother instead of father.
I did
Just
not know
want to
that.
throw that out there.
Okay. I was
It's
not aware of that.
interesting.
Interesting point on that one. So, yes, they are the binding force or the connecting force of all the components we're going to be utilizing. There's a bunch of varieties and flavors and types you can utilize. And we're going to be explaining the key roles. What does it do? We're going to be talking about some of the typical interfaces. How do we connect things? Like yesterday, we were talking about like the P20 connector. We were talking about the CPU ports. We're talking about all these different pieces. We're going to be going into a little more detail on that today. We're going to be talking about required maintenance checks on motherboards, because yes, they do need maintenance, as does everything. We're going to be talking about the steps of installing a motherboard. Hint, they're very similar to what we talked about yesterday. And using the BIOS or UEFI to configure your motherboard. And then we're going to be talking about some common pitfalls, some basic troubleshooting that you can do with regards to your motherboard, common problems, and then we're going to talk a little bit about things you can do to mitigate those issues. And as always, we want to keep our behavior skills and mindsets in mind as we're working through this. In tech, adaptability is one of our core fundamentals for us, because technology is always changing and moving and growing, and we have to be able to adjust our way of operating as new technologies arise. So adaptability is key, and situations may not always be ideal, but we may have to find less than ideal solutions in order to solve these problems. Also, persistence. In this class, this is one of the key ideals that's going to get you through. Because persistence, it's easy to be persistent when things are easy and you're constantly succeeding and you're just blowing through the exercises and it's just, not a problem, not a problem, not a problem. It's easy to be persistent then. It really gets tested when you don't understand something. You can't seem to figure out a lab. You can't seem to figure out an assignment. And it just seems like you keep stumbling every step of the way. Remember, it's a game of inches. Some inches are going to come easy. You're going to blow right through it. Some you're going to have to fight and claw for. But persistence and continual persistence and driving forward is going to make it so that you are successful. And that's what we want to be here, right? Our whole goal here is to succeed and attain that certification so that we can change the trajectory of our career paths. All right. So with all that in mind, I'd like to hand it over to Rachel.
Oh, this is my segue. Okay. Thank you.
I'm not good at like casual segues. I have to do the hard segue. Okay, it's yours. Sorry.
But I paid attention. So as we go over these slides, I'm going to ask you guys for participation in sharing out the slides. But we're going to start with what is a motherboard? The motherboard is also known as the MOBO and provides the foundation for the PCs since it connects directly or indirectly to all pieces of hardware. Can someone read out the next point?
It is a multi-layered circuit board containing copper paths called traces that carry signals and voltages across the board.
Okay, and the next point?
Some layers carry
Some
data
layers-
for input, output, while other layers distribute the power from the power supply.
Okay, and someone can go next.
The interface to configure the motherboard is called the BIOS.
Thank you. And when we say BIOS, do we know what we mean by that?
Basic input output system, I think.
Very good, very good. It's a point to remember, okay? So motherboard form factors. All motherboards come in a rectangular or square shape, but vary in overall size and layout and built-in components. So the form factors applies to the case, the motherboard and power supply, and defines how the air moves around the case, which is very important. The most popular motherboard forms are ATX, micro ATX, ITX. And ITX is not actually a form factor, but a family of form factors, which includes, and I think you may have seen in the reading, the mini ITX, the nano ITX, and the pico ITX. And of course, there's the mobile ITX. Form factor comparisons. Who can share the information under the standard ATX?
12 point times 9.6 inches, popular factor with multiple variations.
Right. So remember 12 by 9.6 or 9.5, but 9.6 inches. Remember that size. It's good to remember that. And for the micro ATX, who can share the size?
It is
9.6 times 9.6 inches, around 30% smaller. Use standard connections.
Thank you. Thank you both. And the mini ITX?
6.7 by 6.7 inches, low power design and embedded systems.
Thank you. Now, in my recollection, it's good to remember the sizes of these boards because you may be asked about it on test. Okay, so it might be good to take a screenshot of this or make sure you use the student pace that's in Slack.
And just, I mean, kind of remember the ATX is just slightly larger than a standard sheet of paper.
Good
And
point.
it tends to be the only rectangular one. All the others tend to be square. For desktops.
Thank you. Yeah, that is a good way to remember that. Motherboards determine the type of case, the power supply, type and number of slots, the CPU socket, the type and number of memory modules, the speed of memory and CPU, the chipset, and compatibility for plug and play. So we talked about yesterday, you know, the CPU socket, and we talked about the RAM modules as well. And it's just giving a depiction of where these components are placed. So expansion slots and sockets. Who can share out this slide for me?
PCI, peripheral component interconnect. The first PCI bus had a 32-bit data path, supplied 5 volts of power to an adapter card, and operated at 33 megahertz. PCI version 2.0, 2 introduced the 64-bit 3.3 volt PCI slot, doubling data throughput of the bus. Because a card can be damaged if installed in the wrong voltage slot, a notch in the PCI slot distinguishes between a 5 volt slot and a 3.3 volt slot. Conventional PCI is no longer evolving and ended up with 4 types of slots. It can achieve bandwidth of 133, 266, or 532 megabytes a second.
Thank you. So the conventional PCI is more like legacy right now. But it's interesting to note when you look at the notches that are in those slots, it depicts different voltages, which I think I might be getting ahead of myself because that comes a little bit further in the presentation. Yeah. So here are the voltages. It's just a depiction. So these notches are important. And we would not try to jam a card in there that does not fit or follow the notch layout. But remember what PCI stands for, Peripheral Component Interconnect. It's good to, write that down or put that on a flashcard for yourself. Expansion slots and sockets. Okay, you can share out this slide.
PCIX, Peripheral Component Interconnect Extended, offers a high-speed alternative to PCI, uses a 64-bit data path, and had 3 major revisions. PCIX focused on the server market. Mini PCI, laptop expansion card. Smaller version of the PCI slots are used in laptops, all-in-one computers, and with small form factor motherboards. It is designated to use low power consumption and to lie flat.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, designed to use low power consumption.
Thank you very much. So we know that laptops have many PCIs. The PCIX is just good to know where we're coming from because we have even evolved past that. So here we have accelerated graphics ports, and they're giving you a depiction of those ports, and you see that there are different notches for the voltage levels. And here we go, the PCIe. Who can share out the top information in black about the PCIe?
Peripheral component interconnect express, or PCIe, is a high-speed alternative to PCI and AGP. PCI Express uses a serial bus, which is faster than a parallel bus. Comes in 4 different slot sizes depending on the number of lanes, called PCI Express ×1, by 1, or ×4, ×8, and ×16. The most common PCIe is ×16, used for video cards.
Thank you. And below it just gives you a little chart of the different versions and the address lanes and the throughput. So as we can see, the throughput increased dramatically. And a lot of times you'll see questions that are referring to the PCIe. which is peripheral component interconnect express. And that's another word that you want to remember. Or acronym, not a word. Okay, and this is depiction of the PCIe by 16 by 4. And then it's also showing the conventional PCI slot. And you have the PCIe by 1. You just want to get used to looking at the differences of the sizing there. Because a lot of times, you know, in your labs or on the tests, we may have you identify that.
There is a question in the chat.
The PCIe is a faster data rate. Did that answer the question? Okay, just want to make sure. Thank you for telling me there's a question too. Chipset. Who could share out about the chipset?
Every motherboard has a chipset, which is one or more integrated circuit chips that support CPUs interfacing to all other devices. The chipset must be compatible with the processor it serves. The most common set of chips are Northbridge, which connects to the high-speed interfaces, like CPU, RAM, video. It is located close to the CPU. Southbridge connects the lower speed devices, such as hard drives, USB expansion devices, and BIOS. It handles all the I/O functions. They are embedded in the motherboard with its own heat sinks. The two major chipset manufacturers are Intel and AMD.
Thank you very much. So this depiction or this image, I would take a screenshot of this because there's what the North Bridge handles and what the South Bridge handles. And also they have their own heat sinks. So when we're looking at the board, it's important to identify those components and what they do and the fact that they do have a heat sink.
So pretty much the North Bridge is in charge of handling like the memory connections. The South Bridge takes care about pretty much the input and output connections, correct?
Right. Okay, just want to make sure everyone has a shot of that. Okay, and who can share out this slide?
New technologies allow the CPU to absorb the North Bridge to increase communication speed with RAM and video. Only the South Bridge is visible in the motherboard. Its name changed to Platform Controller Hub.
And there is another depiction. It's just that you may not exactly be tested on this, but it's good to have the information in hand so you know where we're coming from or what we're talking about. And so this is kind of like a good layout example. Okay, who can read about the clock generator?
A system crystal determines the speed at which a CPU, cheapest, and RAM operate. It is usually quartz oscillate or soldered to the motherboard. Its generator frequency megahertz, where 1 megahertz million cycles per second.
Thank you. The quartz oscillator, I'm not an expert on at all, but I know it has to do with the electrical impulses and reverberations that are sent throughout the board. I've not received a question about that, but unless Kelly wants to add something to that.
Yeah, I'm a geek at stuff like this. It's called the piezoelectric effect.
Yes.
And it's when you put an electrical current through a quartz crystal, it vibrates at a consistent and predictable rate. So this is how we were able to set the clock speed for computers and why quartz crystals were used in watches for many years. So we were able to set and pace our times based upon it through a minor electric current.
Isn't that interesting?
I thought so. Most people
Yeah.
don't.
It is. It is. Okay, so back to our basic input-output services. Motherboard ROM BIOS serves 3 purposes. Who can read the 3?
One, system BIOS data and instructions, codes that enable the CPU to communicate and manage devices such as keyboard, mouse, hard drives, memory, and monitor. It is stored in a flash ROM or ROM chips that can be overwritten. Number 2, startup BIOS performed hardware initialization during the booting process, POST. 3, BIOS setup changes motherboard settings. It is stored in a CMOS RAM, which is built into Southbridge. Includes date, time, port configurations, boot order. Requires a battery to keep all settings.
Thank you. So the BIOS and is stored in the flash ROM, and ROM, what do we think that stands for?
Read-only memory.
Thank you. Another term to remember. And so if hardware initializing is being performed in the boot process, it's called, the post process or posting. And what does post stand for?
Is that the power on self-test?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Another acronym to remember. And what is this battery called? That's in the image.
CMOS
battery.
And there's also the firmware chip. Does anyone know why the battery is important?
Isn't it holds a charge that allows data and time to be saved on a computer?
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for the chat remarks as well. Okay, Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, UEFI. Another acronym to know, and you will be seeing it a lot in questions. Who can share out this slide?
Firmware
that is
more.
oh,
Sorry.
no, go ahead.
Firmware that is more robust and secure than BIOS used in modern systems. Link BIOS is responsible for managing essential devices before the OS is launched, starting the computer and managing motherboard systems. Supports file systems that enable booting to drives larger than 2.2 terabytes. Supports 32-bit or 64-bit booting. Supports graphical interface to configure CMOS.
Thank you. And that's mostly what you'll be seeing on more recent laptops and computers today. It's using the UEFI, Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. And basically, because it supports the 32-bit and 64-bit booting, and drives larger than the 2.2 terabytes. It's just giving you an example of what the interface may look like. Okay, connectors. Another scripture, not scripture, another screen to do a screenshot. So you have the fan connectors. There can be 2-pin, 3-pin, 4-pin. You have a Molex connector, which is a power connector for the power supply. And does anyone know by chance the connector for the power supply, what it's called? You can just take a guess.
Molex.
Okay, there's more. But thank you for guessing. We'll get to it shortly. I just wanted to check, but it's something I want you to remember, but we'll come to it. You see where it says front panel? And it's like connectors for the speaker, for the power LED, hard drive LED. I know this is like a small image, but you will see this in one of your labs. And these are connectors that you're really going to want to pay attention to for that lab. And it can be a lab that's frustrating. Just know that these connectors go into the front panel connection. And you have to be very careful with the way you place them when they have to follow a certain order and pattern. And that's why Kelly was like, make sure you look at the documentation for the motherboard. Okay, so we also have the IDE for the board, and the should be SATA connectors, or the connection for the connectors, and the USB. So you just want to get familiar with what these are called and what they look like. Okay, and back again to what the USB 2.0, DisplayPort, and HDMI, USB 3.0. And what is the difference between the 2.0 connection and the 3.0 for USB?
3.0 is faster.
Absolutely. And visually, what usually is the difference too?
The 0.3,
2.0 is
3.0 is blue.
Color
Yeah,
code.
yeah. It's
The color.
2.0 is black and 3.0 is blue.
Thank you. And also down below it shows the network port, FireWire port, again, USB, eSATA connections, which usually are external connections for hard drive, and 6 audio ports. It's just another angle of looking at it. Do people still use FireWire? I believe some people do. Yeah, Brandon. Okay, so this depiction of the motherboard, take another screenshot of this. and just take a moment to really look at everything that's there. CPU socket, CPU fan, heatsink mounting points. "20-pin ATX power connector." And I know it says it somewhere in here, but that power connector, the reason why I was asking about it because it's referred to as the P1 connector. And you'll see that sometimes in questions. Memory slot, Northbridge heatsink.
I have a question.
Mhm.
So there are so many capacitor on the motherboard. So each capacitor like represent for each parts. Like
Say again about the capacitors.
yeah, like the capacitor, there are so many. So they are like represent each parts like the CPU or for example the expansion slot or the VGA or those stuff. So
I hear what you're saying. Yeah, I would have to defer to Kelly more about that because I don't really know that much about the capacitors, but I do know that they're needed to run those and regulate those components on the board.
Yeah, they're basically
Unless
just power store for various components. And obviously geographic location on the board is going to be closer to the components they're serving.
okay, thank you.
So if they're there to serve the North Bridge, you're going to see a cluster of them near the North Bridge. You see a cluster of them near the CPU, they're there probably to help support the CPU.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so here we have the motherboard. And as you can see, there aren't any labels. So you guys would need to try to label it. Anyone want to call out a letter and try to label that part?
Hey, PCS.
eCPU,
HID,
G P1 connector.
F is RAM.
F. A is the 16, I think the 16 thing PCI, if I'm not mistaken. B, okay.
and CMOS battery.
J, SATA.
Okay. And
CPU socket. Is that what that is?
Did you say E?
Yes, E. Is that a
Okay.
CPU socket?
Yes. Did we miss some? Let me see. Okay, L. And thank you. I is a fan connector. Yeah. Anyone know what L is?
Is that the case connections?
Yes, you can call it that, but it's also referred
It's a
to.
PCI connection.
Not exactly. But I'm going to go back to case connections. It was in that slide that I said it's important to remember where these connections go. They're little small connections for the speaker and the LED power light, hard
Peripherals?
drive.
Is it an IDE connector?
No,
Mm,
but good guess.
Amex or I don't remember.
It's
Say
not
it again.
P1, right?
No. So I know it's very small.
The port that I just had it. It's called the East SATA port. Is it that?
It's not that one. And
Front
a
panel
lot of times that
connections.
one's red. So say again.
Front panel.
Yes, absolutely. But thank you all for your guesses, and it's a good try. Remember front panel connections. I beg you, it is in a lab. Small but important. Okay. Okay, did anyone say D?
North Bridge. Is that the North Bridge?
You're right about that, the North Bridge, but the connector is,
Is that the CPU power connector?
yes. To me, when they're a little bit more substantial connectors, thicker connectors, and usually, well, no, I'm not going to say the color, but they will be for the power.
Is C an AGP slot?
C. It is not, but a good guess.
I'm pretty
Is
sure that's a PCIe by 16 slot.
yes. Thank you. So if you guys have a picture of this, take a screenshot of this and keep it. There's a legend for it.
What was
But
I?
keep in mind, fan, where is it? Where is it? Fan connector.
I thought you said it was a front panel for I.
L is the front panel. L is front panel. I is fan connector. And usually there'll be more than one fan connector. And you want to keep this in mind when you're doing labs as well.
You mean the CPU fan connector or the mother? For I.
It's just a fan connector for the board.
So for the fans that go around in the case, right?
Yes, because you also have your CPU fan and heatsink, and that will have a connector. Then there are other fan connectors on the board. I'm saying this because you'll have a lab and you'll have different like connectors at the front and to the back for fan. Okay, this is going to be a matching game. Just do the best you can, because I promise you'll get more practice with this as we go on in the course, okay? Before I go over the objective revisited, was there any question that you guys found particularly hard on in that little game?
What's chip creek or creep?
Chip
I was like-
creep.
yeah, I
Yeah.
was like, what is that?
Anyone want to answer his question?
It's essentially when I guess the chip that's inserted through contraction or expansion from the heat, it causes it to slide or dislodge a little bit. So I guess the maintenance is making sure that it's all the way secured.
All right.
Right. Thank you. Yeah.
The question on the BIOS, whether it's a short circuit or not, I was like, that could potentially be one, but is it the best one?
So usually if hardware is not detected in the BIOS, does someone have any experience in what happens?
I'm sorry. I just wanted to let you know that I'm continuously getting kicked out of the meeting along with Nearpod. I'm not even sure if you guys can hear me.
We can hear you. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Just
it's
having
just
some technical difficulty.
okay, yeah, because every 30 seconds it keeps restarting the meeting. Now, I've missed the last 10 minutes.
I can understand. And that's why we also have student paced and it's recorded as well in
Okay,
case there
great.
are difficulties. So it'll be okay, but sorry that's happening to you.
All right, thank you, man.
You're welcome. The BIOS not recognizing hardware. Anybody have experience with that?
The only thing I came across on upgrading to NVMe drive, but I was gonna see it, and then Windows installation couldn't see it. So I think it's related to a setting, because y'all know you could do RAID and switch it to another mode. It's I don't know. I know it's kind of complicated, but
Right.
that's
You
the only
went
thing I
really
came
deep with
across.
that one.
Yeah, because I was trying
Thank
to
you.
fix it.
Yeah, I can understand. If it doesn't recognize it, it's like it's not there.
Or
That's it.
if like, like if you try to upgrade your CPU and like the BIOS revision for that motherboard hasn't been like updated yet and doesn't recognize the CPU, then your computer won't turn on. So sometimes you might need like an older CPU in order to update the BIOS, and then you use your new CPU. That has happened to me before.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So basically, we explained the key role of motherboard, described and identified components and typical interfaces found in the motherboard, identified required maintenance, and we went back over some steps for installing the motherboard and using the BIOS to configure the motherboard, identified common pitfalls for installing or difficulties, also troubles or problems that may come up with the motherboard, including overheating and power problems. And actually, we'll probably get into that a little bit more too, a little later in our sessions. And we described how to solve problems that come up with motherboards. And I guarantee you that I know there's a lot of this in your reading, but there's what we've gone over is in a lot of our test banks about the motherboard, maintenance and components. And there will also be questions about the power supply, which we'll go more into depth with as well. But I thank you guys so much for participating. And I would just like to give the mic back to Kelly.